Welcome, everybody. We are here with Tim. Oh darn, Maywalt. Sorry about that.
Just Tim.
Tim. He has a master's degree in forestry from Syracuse University and has been with Blue Ridge Prism since its inception. Has been a tree steward since 2010. He volunteers on the grounds crew at Monticello and delivers seasonal invasive species identification and treatment workshops for the Blue Ridge Prism. As we're here to listen to a talk about English ivy and winter creeper, which we're excited to hear about. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box and we'll answer questions at the end of the talk. So thank you, welcome.
Yeah, let me get the slides up here. Oop. Getting a little ahead of myself. Okay, so yeah, my name is Tim Maywalt, and a number of these slides I developed with our program director at Blue Ridge Prism, Beth Mizell, so I wanted to give her credit for that. We're going to talk about English ivy and winter creeper. We're going to talk about them together because in so many respects they're similar enough that the ways you're going to deal with them are essentially identical. There's a little bit of a tweak that I'll talk about later, but by and large you treat them pretty much the same. And you know, I think you all understand the value of trees and what a threat to trees that invasive vines present. And there's a lot of them. We'll talk about ivy and winter creeper, but there's bittersweet, honeysuckle, kudzu, porcelainberry, the non-native wisterias, which like to strangle trees. So there's a lot of bad guys out there. They use various techniques to kill trees. The smothering technique, basically they grow up the tree and spread their leaves out over the leaves of the tree or the shrub or whatever they're growing on and block photosynthesis. So they tend to starve them. They reduce their ability to produce food. Their additional weight, which the tree is designed to hold its own weight, not the weight of strangers, so they can cause breaking. They'll break branches, they'll break the main stem at the top. And because they hold a lot of weight, they can create the sail effect, which involves their creating more and more wind resistance than the tree can handle and can blow down. And they're also adding a lot of top weight, which is a particular problem in situations like we had around here in Piedmont, Virginia in January, where we had a very, very heavy snow. And we lost a lot of trees, and many of them, invasive vines were a contributing factor. So smothering, breaking, and toppling are the mechanisms. And we'll talk about ivy and winter creeper together because of their similarities. They're both evergreen, which is good news and bad news. The bad news is they're growing all the time, year round. They don't go dormant. The good news is they're a viable target year round if you're in an area where herbicide can be used and if you're an herbicide user. They're both attached vines, which means you need to learn the technique that you use for dealing with a vine that you can't easily get off the tree. Your treatment options for them are virtually identical. And of course, they're easy to find at your local nursery or your big box store, in case you don't have enough on your property. So when you look at invasive vines, they have three different growth habits. Girdling or twining, as you see over here. This happens to be bittersweet, but this is also what you'll see is the technique for a number of the others. The two we're going to look at tonight are attached vines. They use, excuse me, they use adventitious roots to grab a hold of whatever they're growing on, to grab a hold of the bark of a tree, or the mortar between bricks on the side of a structure or whatever. Those roots do not penetrate through the bark. They're not parasitical. They aren't tapping into the vascular system. They're just there to hold them on so they can continue to grow upward, which is the goal of all of these. They want to get into the sun. Getting into the sun gives them more energy, allows them to grow more. And lastly, you have the unattached vines. This also happens to be bittersweet. So sometimes you'll see it just hanging free like this, or you'll see it girdling. And the way it attaches has implications for how you're going to go at it. So here's our old buddy English ivy, and you're probably all familiar with what it looks like. Its form is typically a 3-lobed leaf, 1, 2, 3. Sometimes you'll see it in a 5-lobed version. And this is the immature version of it, what you see on the ground or what you see low on a tree. As you get further up a tree, you're liable to see this form. This is the mature form of English ivy. And you'll see it's just one, just one lobe, and it's typically a lighter green in color. And the bad news here is that when it converts from its immature form, that's the only way it can spread when it's immature is by creeping. But once it reaches maturity, it starts to produce fruit. And here you can see this very dark, almost black fruit, which you'll see on the plant in January, February, March. You can see this is on a bed of snow here. And because they fruit in deep winter, sometimes they're the only thing around for birds to eat. Birds don't like to eat them. They will eat them when there's nothing else around. They actually make them somewhat ill, but they'll eat them. And the proof of that you can see in this photo. This stuff didn't spread from the bottom of the trees until the seed had been dropped by birds. So birds perch in the tree. You may be aware of the mechanism that birds will eat the fruit and their stomach acid can digest the fruit, but they can't digest the seeds. But what their stomach acids will do is they'll scrape off the outer layer of the seed and get the seed to the point where it's almost ready to germinate. And then of course it comes out of them and it's sitting there on the ground in a puddle of fertilizer. And that's why you see it all over the place. Winter creeper, pretty much the same thing. You see it bedded first, where it's spread by creeping, and then it starts climbing. Its leaf structure is quite a bit different. It's a single lobe leaf. They're smaller. They're toothed on the edges. Both of these are pretty easy to identify, particularly in the winter. Although, if you see a green vine growing on a tree in the winter, it's invasive. It doesn't matter all that much what name you put on it. It needs to go away. This is what its fruit looks like. They're smaller and they're red than what you see on the English ivy. So we're really here to talk about controlling them. This is a photograph of Monticello about 10 years ago, which is when I started working there. I took ivy off about 2,000 trees there over the course of 3 years. And you can see, if you look at this one right here, that's about a 6-inch vine. This is English ivy. So it gets big. Winter creeper, usually about this size will be the max, maybe a little bit bigger. And you have to use a chainsaw for these. It's too much effort to try to cut them with a handsaw. And so let's get into these techniques here in a minute. So working for Blue Ridge Prism, we often get the question, I have on my property invasive trees and shrubs and vines, and I've got stiltgrass and I've got garlic mustard. Where do I start? What should I make my priority? And we always say start with the vines. And the reason we say that is because the vines can take down a tree, and that leaves this situation here where you've got a hole in the canopy. And now sunlight can get through and get onto the forest floor where it wasn't before. And that's going to help germination on the part of all of the seeds that are in the seed bed, of which a lot of them are going to be invasive. So we want to maintain the canopy. We want to keep the trees where they are. So protect your trees first, get the vines first. And a second point I'd make is that you don't have to spend any effort at all on taking the vines off the tree. Your goal is simply to kill them. They are, a few things are going to happen in the 2 to 3 months after you, let's say you just cut them. We'll look at some cutting techniques in a minute here. First thing that happens is they start to dry out, and about 60% of their weight is water weight. So immediately there, within the first 2 or 3 months, you've relieved the tree of a lot of its strain trying to hold these things up. Secondly, the leaves are going to wilt and either drop off or blow off. So again, within 2 to 3 months, you've significantly reduced the sail effect, the likelihood of the tree to blow down because of the added wind resistance from the leaves. So you don't have to take the vines off. You immediately over the first 2 or 3 months, you get a lot of relief to the tree just by killing it. And another problem, of course, with taking the vines off, you make some cuts and you start pulling on them. They're not light and they're going to come down on you. And there's a safety issue here. You don't want to hurt yourself. The vines could very easily be wrapped around a dead branch, and you pull a dead branch down on your head. That can discourage you doing this kind of work. So cut them and leave them. They will come off on their own, although it takes quite a while for that to happen. It can be 3 to 5 years before you see the bigger ones coming off, but they will. Third thing, I'll be talking about herbicides. I know some people use them, some do not. And even if you're an herbicide user, there are a lot of situations. As volunteers, we tend to work in parks, and some parks say, no, you cannot use herbicides within our park. Just as an aside on that, if you are an herbicide user, you don't have to be a certified applicator in order to apply herbicides if you're working on your own property or you're working on someone else's private property and you're not being paid for the work, you're doing it as a volunteer. And thirdly, if you're working on public grounds and you're accompanied by a municipal representative who is also a certified applicator. So there are a lot of occasions when you can apply herbicides. There are others where you can't. Let's see. Okay, we're going to talk about 3 main tools here. The typical ones you're going to be using are going to be some kind of a saw, a folder or a straight blade saw, fixed blade saw, hand cutter. You may be using some other cutting device. I use a hatchet a lot, and I'll show you how I use them. But you can go to the store and buy a decent saw for 20 bucks or so. A decent hand cutter for, this one is $25. I use it because it has an internal spring. Most hand cutters have an external spring. You see it right about down here, high up on the handle, and they can pop off, and then you're out of business. So you have to be carrying a spare spring around with you all the time. And hatchets, you can buy hatchets for 20 bucks as well. Let's talk about this. If you're an herbicide applicator and you're working in an area where they're allowed to be used, there are a number of different applicators that you can use. This one right here is called a dauber. And it's basically, you're kind of a bingo bottle. And the thing that's really attractive about this is you can take this bottle, turn it upside down, hold it over your hand and shake it, and not a drop will come out. It only applies herbicide when you touch it to a cut surface on the plant. And it only applies a very, very tiny amount. So it's a very precise tool. Then there are drip bottles. You just put a couple of drops on a cut end, or typically that's how it's used. Spray bottle requires you to have some skill. I use a spray bottle exclusively, and you get used to how to use them and how to make sure you're not overspraying or underspraying. You're not spraying something you don't want to spray. You're not spraying so much that it's dripping. So you can be very precise with it with a little bit of practice. Okay, so some generalities about control. first is get the vines off the trees. Start with the climbing vines before you start getting the bedded stuff. This is your typical situation, minus the goats. Ivy or wintercreeper are climbing up the trees, and they started down here on the ground and started to climb. So get the stuff off the trees first, because you want to protect the trees. You want to maintain the continuity of your canopy. Then get the stuff that's on the ground. I mentioned before, don't pull the vines from the trees. Like in this photograph, cut them and leave them. They'll come off eventually. Once you do have them off the trees, then you need to concentrate on the stuff that's on the ground, the bedded stuff. And there are lots of ways you can deal with that. Hand pulling, if there's not a lot. If it's fairly flat terrain, you can mow. You can use a string trimmer. Again, these are techniques without herbicide. You can use tarping. We'll take a look at tarping, laying out tarps or laying out cardboard to smother them. Another name for tarping is smothering. And then if you're in a situation where you can use herbicide, you can spray them with herbicide. One thing about both of these plants that you've probably noticed is they have thick, waxy leaves. So when you look at guidance on what concentration of typical systemic herbicides to use, you're told use 2 to 4% concentration. For these two plants, you'll sometimes use 5 or 6%, a slightly higher concentration of herbicide, because those leaves are so hard to penetrate. And then, of course, you have goats. Goats are pretty cool to watch. You need to be looking for a goat herd who is experienced in vegetation management. Not just everybody who has goats know how to do this. The shortcoming with them, of course, is they eat what's on the surface and have no effect on the roots. So it's going to grow back. And they're not inexpensive. So it's really pretty much the same thing as having gone out and cut it and not applied an herbicide. One benefit about using goats is they're good for PR. If you advertise the fact that you're going to have goats working in a particular area, you're going to attract a lot of people. They're going to bring their kids. The kids are going ooh and ah. And you're talking to the parents about how this tree right here is what these trees back here are going to look like if you don't do something. So they're really good for attracting people, getting their attention, and then being able to talk to them about the threat that's posed by non-native invasive plants. But they're not really very effective at control. If you use them, you're going to have them back again to rebrowse at fairly regular intervals, just as if you had cut the vines without applying herbicide. They're going to grow back. You're going to have to come back at fairly regular intervals to cut again, which is fine. I mean, it's a viable technique. It just requires more work. Okay, so let's talk. We're going to look at English ivy here, but everything that I say about it is the same for wintercreeper. And this is the typical thing that you'll see is you can't see the vines because they're covered by the leaves. So the leaves are just in the way. The first thing you want to do is get the leaves out of the way so you can see what you have. And I just take a saw and run it down the side of, not the tree, the vines. See, the vines are covering the tree, so you're not going to damage the tree by doing this. Just run your saw down the side of it, and it will strip off all the leaves and leave you like this. And now you can see what your targets are. So one of the most straightforward techniques and an effective technique is to simply cut the vines, but you have to cut them twice, because if you only cut once through with a saw, they can actually reseal, and you don't want that. You just wasted all your time. So you have to take out a divot, and here you can see I've taken out about a 6-inch piece. It doesn't have to be 6 inches. It could be 2 inches, but you need to make a cut low and then a cut a little bit higher so that they can't reseal. So if you're an herbicide user in an area where you can apply herbicide, you would have done this, and then you'd go around to all of these lower cuts, the ones that are attached to the root system, and you apply an herbicide. And you can see here that I used an herbicide with a dye. I always use an herbicide with a dye because it helps me to see what I've hit and what I've missed. And the dye disappears after a couple of days. It's kind of like watercolor. It's not persistent or long-term. It just washes away. So made the cut and then applied the herbicide. This technique is called cut stump. It uses a fairly high concentration of herbicide, 20 to 25%, versus foliar application where you're spraying and using, as I recommended, maybe 5 or 6%. But you're using a very, very small amount. Just a couple of drops is all it takes. And the goal of it is to get the herbicide onto the surface so that it can sit there long enough to be absorbed into the vascular tissue, which is just inside the bark. Herbicides don't move themselves. They have to be moved from their point of application somewhere above ground, like in these cuts, into the roots. And during the growing season, the way they get there is by being transported through the normal movement of liquids through the vascular system of the plant downward. Photosynthesis is producing food in the leaves. That food's being distributed throughout the tree, and some of it is going into the roots to be stored for winter, because that comprises the food supply for dormancy. So there's downward movement occurring during the growing season, and that's going to carry the herbicide into the roots, which is where they do their damage. And various herbicides kill in different ways. Some of them create a block between two parts of the amino acid compound that keeps it from forming. No amino acids, no life. Others disrupt the process by which the plant naturally neutralizes the waste products of the chemical processes that are occurring within the plant. We're chemistry labs, our bodies, plant bodies, there's chemical reactions occurring all the time. And they create waste products. And some herbicides keep the plant from getting rid of the waste products, and they basically poison themselves, kill themselves. Okay, so what we've been talking about so far is cutting through all the vines twice in order to leave a gap so they can't reseal. Now, if you're an herbicide user and if you're working in an area where herbicides are allowed, there's a much more efficient technique to use that requires a lot less effort on your part for larger vines. And that's called hack and squirt. And this is where your hatchet comes in handy. So you can see on this vine, this is about a 3-inch vine. I put a hack in here, I put a hack in here, and then I spray in just a very small amount of herbicide. You notice there's just a little bit of a drip here. There's none's being wasted, none of it's hitting the ground. And that gets what I've done by making these cuts, again, is I've created access into the vascular system of the plant. And again, these guys they're evergreens. They're always photosynthesizing. So there's always downward movement into the roots. And that downward movement is going to carry the herbicide into the roots where it will kill the plant. But let's see. I don't have it here. This is, as I said, about a 3-inch vine. Consider what you would have to do with cutting. You'd have to cut it twice. Maybe cut right about here and then cut right about here. That's 6 inches of cutting versus 2 hacks with a hatchet. So I think you see the efficiency of the hack and squirt technique. Now, it only works on the bigger vines. You don't want to use it on the really little guys. In fact, the little ones, you can kind of see right here, until the vine gets to be 3/4 of an inch to an inch, it doesn't start to develop the adventitious roots that are going to hold it to the tree. So you can hand pull these, and they won't peel the bark off because they're not attached to the bark yet. And you just pull them till they get down to the ground, and then you can pull them out of the ground, complete with their roots. So you can hand pull the little ones and cut or hack and squirt the big ones. And then you have the in-between size ones. And here's the in-betweeners, maybe an inch around or so, from 3/4 of an inch to, which is the point where they're starting to develop the adventitious roots and starting to get attached, up to the point where they're big enough for hack and squirt. And I've done a similar thing with a hatchet. Instead of cutting into it though, because it's kind of thin and I don't want to cut through and damage the tree, I'm slicing straight down with the hatchet, cutting almost straight down and just taking off the last, maybe 3/8 of an inch of it. The goal again is to expose the vascular tissue so that when I spray on a little bit, tiny bit of herbicide, it has access to the vascular tissue and can get down to the roots. So those are some fast techniques for dealing with situations where you have a lot of ivy that you're dealing with, or a lot of winter creeper, and you don't want to wear yourself out making these big 6 inches and you're putting 2 cuts into them. It's just a lot of effort. So if you're an herbicide user, if you're allowed in a particular locale to use herbicide, these techniques are very fast and low energy, so you can get more done. All right. Everything you do with the vines on the tree is great, but it doesn't do anything for what's on the ground. And you can kill everything around this tree or this tree or this tree, and it's simply going to grow back. Now it's going to take a while. Certainly if you're cutting 2 or 3 inch vines, it takes a few years for them to get that big. So you're definitely slowing the process up if you only deal with what's on the trees. But to give yourself a long-term solution, you need to get what's on the ground as well. And if there's, if it's not like this, where it's just the entire forest floor is covered with it, if there's only a little, you can hand pull it. English ivy is fairly responsive, and so is winter creeper to hand pulling. The conditions have to be right. The soil needs to be moist. It's great to do this in the winter after you've had a snowfall and the snow is melted. The soil's nice and wet. It's easy to pull out. But when you have this much here, you've got to go to some different techniques. If you're in a situation where things are nice and flat and there's not a lot of debris on the ground, you may be able to mow. You may be able to use various mowing devices. They're a little bit more formidable than a lawnmower. You can use a string trimmer. The problem with any of the mowing techniques is they're purely physical techniques, and you won't have affected the roots, so it will grow back. But the grow back is going to be less dense. So mow or cut or string trim, and then come back 6-8 weeks later and just deal with the grow back, which is going to be less. Now keep in mind that the way it got there in the first place most likely was not by creeping, but most likely was by seeding, by birds eating the fruit and dropping the seeds. So there is seed in the ground. So you can do the best job of taking it off the trees and getting it off the ground. You're still going to get more growth. But there's going to be a lot less. It'll be a lot more manageable. Now, if you're an herbicide user and you're in an area where you can use herbicides and you've got extensive bedded ivy like this, you have a couple of different approaches. One is you can do foliar application, that is spray. But as I mentioned before, you need to use a somewhat higher concentration of herbicide. Instead of 2 to 4%, you may be using 5 or 6%. Or you can go through the area first with a string trimmer and cut it. And you're not cutting it flat, parallel with the ground like you would, if you're trimming your lawn or something. You want to turn it upward so that the string is cutting downward. And you're going to be cutting up the the stems and the leaves themselves and opening up the vascular system, then you can use a lower concentration of herbicide because you've overcome the issue of those thick waxy leaves by creating openings into the vascular tissue by cutting. So you go back to a 2 to 4% concentration, less herbicide in the ecosystem. Although, 2% is pretty low. Okay, so then there's smothering. And smothering is a pretty effective technique. Basically, what you'll use, you can use cardboard, you can use various forms of plastic, and you lay the plastic down, and then you need to secure it somehow. And typically, the way it's done is by using wood chips. If you know an arborist, or if there's somebody cutting down trees in your neighborhood, heaven forbid, but happens every day. Just go over and talk to them and say, hey, what are you going to do with your chips when you're done? Because they chip up the tree and they'll end up with a truck full of chips. And they have to pay to unload those chips. So they're always looking for a place to do it. So you can always find chips, and typically for free. So put down your plastic, put the chips on top, and you need to leave it in place for about 3 months. Then you go back. You can reuse the wood chips, the plastic. You can reuse the plastic as well. And underneath, there isn't any live ivy or winter creeper anymore. Next season, you may get some growth from the seed bed, but you'll also get growth of whatever the native plants are that have seeds in the seed bed that were there before the ivy encroached. So that's smothering or tarping. So we've looked at a number of different techniques here. I do want to mention that I don't want you to be discouraged. Whatever technique you use, if you go back and look at the tree where you've been doing the work, a week later, it won't look any different. If you go back a month later, it won't look any different. If you go back 2 months later, it may still not look any different. It may be 3 months before you start to see this. And here you're seeing wilting of the leaves, okay? And the reason for that is because the vines themselves and the leaves, the thick waxy leaves, hold an awful lot of moisture. They hold a lot of energy, and they can keep themselves alive for quite a while. It doesn't mean you did it wrong, doesn't mean you didn't do the right thing. It just takes a long time for you to see the results. And I do want to mention, don't cut into the tree when you're making your cuts, okay? Protect the tree. So yeah, it takes a little while to get used to the technique so that you're not damaging the tree. I sometimes use a chainsaw, but I don't cut all the way through. If I'm doing a 3-inch vine with a chainsaw, I will stop at about a 1/2 inch before the end. So I've cut all the way in except for a 1/2 inch. And then I'll take, I usually have a hatchet with me. I'll take a hatchet and just whack it, and it'll break it the rest of the way. And I have not gone anywhere near the bark with that chainsaw. So don't damage your trees. Our goal out there is to protect the trees. Winter creeper. Now, everything we just talked about is the same, except these guys are even more tenacious at holding themselves to the tree, like this. So one thing you can do with them, if you're not an herbicide user, if you're an herbicide user, I would take my hatchet and I would cut vertically down it just to get into the vascular tissue and then spray it. And I would have not gotten anywhere near the tree. But if you're not using herbicide or not allowed to use herbicide, just track it down to where it comes off the tree at the bottom and make your cut here. So you don't have to worry about trying to pull it off the tree or damage the tree by making your cut. Again, you want to leave a divot. So you're going to cut high and you're going to cut low. Here's your little divot. If using herbicide, you would just put a couple drops on there, or touch it with your dauber, or give it a tiny spray with your spray applicator, and that will kill the roots and you won't get grow back. So that's about the only thing that's different about winter creeper, is that it's even more tenaciously attached to the tree, and you want to do your cutting down here at ground level. Okay, so we're going to open up the session in a moment here for questions. But I want to mention, okay, so here's a couple ways you can reach me. We're going to try to answer your questions today. If we don't get to them all, you can reach me through either one of these email addresses. And I think I mentioned that next week, Tuesday evening, May 10th, from 7 to 9, Blue Ridge Prism will be doing our summer workshop. So we do a spring, summer, and winter workshop over the course of the year, because the targets are somewhat different. The techniques are somewhat different based on what time of year it is. Are you in the growing season? Are you in dormancy? Of course, you don't have dormancy for the evergreens. So we'll be talking for a couple hours, looking at identification of trees, shrubs, vines, grasses, and forbs. And then on Thursday evening of next week, I'll be doing the treatment session, and you'll hear some of this again, but I'll also be talking about a much wider range of invasive plants. So if you're interested, just go to the blueridgeprism.org website, and you can sign up for it. I think we have, we can do 1,000 people. So if you're interested, check it out. And I guess, Heidi, we can open it up to questions.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, you can let us know through the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question. There aren't any actually in the chat box currently. So
I have a question. This is Margaret. You mentioned the third way that volunteers can use pesticides, herbicides. And I hadn't heard about this third way, so I'm interested in this. You said the municipal employee or whatever, but did you really mean just any certified pesticide applicator could be your supervisor on a public space land, assuming that there's permission from the owner?
Well, if there were permission from say we're working in a park.
Yeah.
And the park has an agreement with a non-park certified applicator to oversee a group of volunteers, then yes. But usually it's one and the same person or persons. Usually you have park employees who are certified applicators who are supervising volunteers.
Okay.
So it could be either way.
Any certified. Okay. Now, do you know where the code is or regulation or whatever? It would be really helpful for us to be able to show that to people. Because like I said, I hadn't heard about this third way. I was told by an extension agent only about the first two ways.
Mm-hmm. I would have to get back to you with, what I would do is just go to whatever your search engine is and say, become a certified pesticide applicator. And it will tell you what the rules are. It will tell you what the criteria are, but I don't have a site for it specifically that I can give you.
Okay, I'll try and find it. Thank you.
Sure. The problem with I'm not a certified applicator. And the reason I'm not a certified applicator is because it's not difficult to sign up. It's not difficult to take the class. It's not difficult to pass the test. What's very difficult is you have to work for 6 months supervised by a certified applicator. And, most certified applicators have 20 different jobs. It just happens to be, say, a park employee whose job is to, mow the lawns and blow the leaves. And they do some invasive work. So you might get an hour with them a day, and it just takes forever to get certified. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them don't want to take on the liability. Mm-hmm. So it's, unless you work, you become a municipal employee, or you're working on a farm where they're doing this and they have certified applicators, it's really difficult for independent folks like us, volunteers, to get certified. Mm-hmm. Anyhow.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's another good question about herbicide. If properly applied, just what is needed, only on the correct surfaces, no drips or overspray. How environmentally damaging are the herbicides? Are they metabolized by the vine as it is killed?
Yeah. Boy, I have to give the standard answer of anybody in this position, which is it depends. Different herbicides have different activity durations. Some of them are immediately deactivated upon contact with soil. So various ones have different characteristics. A lot of the bad rep from that are associated with herbicides comes from overuse and incorrect use. And every herbicide has a label. This is the label from a Roundup product called Roundup Custom. Roundup Custom is a particularly interesting herbicide to use because it's suitable for both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, which is really good because there's always water out there somewhere, and a lot of herbicides are not suitable for aquatic environments. So some of them are deactivated after a very short time. Some of them will not transmit through root systems into the soil. Some will transmit into the soil from root systems, but then face the issues of just lateral transferability, which is based a lot on soils type. So I live in Piedmont, Virginia, and the soils are all clay. Herbicides don't get very far in the soil, maybe a couple of inches, and then they're held by the clays. And most of them have deactivation periods that are quite short. So they're neutralized quite quickly. Others have longer periods of time that they're active in the soil. So the long answer is read the label. And if you were to look at the label, this is, when you think of a label, this is isopropyl alcohol. And you can see the label. This is the label for Roundup Custom. It's 48 pages long. And it's so small that you'll go nuts trying to read it. So what do? You just Google it or use whatever search engine, and you can get it in a standard PDF document that's easy to read. And you need to read it. You need to understand what the herbicide is that you're using. Some are specific for broadleaf plants, like the ones we've been talking about. Some are specific for grasses and so on. There's a lot to learn about herbicides. They're not simple. Enough on herbicides.
So I have a very large patch of ivy, but recently discovered that there is a lot of Virginia creeper in the same patch. So they want to know if there's a way of eliminating the English ivy, but not hurting the creeper.
Yeah, hand pull or very carefully cut. Right. You want to keep your Virginia creeper, but if you're not using herbicide, you could cut no matter what you cut, whether it's English ivy or English ivy mixed with Virginia creeper or poison ivy, which they're often mixed in with poison ivy, they're going to grow back. If you don't use herbicide, they're going to grow back. So you could temporarily harm the native, but just like the invasive, if you don't use herbicide, it's going to grow back. So it's a temporary displacement in order to meet the bigger goal of trying to get a hold of the invasive. And then you watch what grows back. And, if you go back a few weeks later, your grow back should be whatever, 2, 4, 6 inches. It's very easy then to hand pull. And you can differentiate between your Virginia creeper. I mean, if you're looking at Virginia creeper right now, you guys are maybe a week behind us because you're a little bit further north, but it's that very saggy 5-leaf structure. It's very easy to differentiate that from the thick waxy leaves of new English ivy. So you could cut it all indiscriminately. You could mow it all indiscriminately and then deal with the grow back, foster the good stuff, and get on top of the bad stuff. Otherwise, you have to just be careful when you're taking out the bad guys, not to take out the good guys with them.
I have a question. Where is Virginia creeper found most often? It's like English ivy is typically, around residential areas where it's planted, not always, but typically. Where do you find the Virginia creeper?
Everywhere. It's native, it's a forest plant. It's all over my yard. And I live in an area where a great deal of effort was made to keep the natural environment intact when they built this development back in the 60s. So it's like a forest, and it's all over the place on my property every year. It's an annual, goes back every year. No, it's a perennial. Excuse me.
Perennial.
Yeah, yeah.
Confusing.
You have to replant it every year. No, it's a perennial. Yeah, so it's all over the place, and you bring up an interesting point. When you're out in the woods and you start encountering English ivy, or you start finding stuff like leatherleaf mahonia, you know that you're near development. These were things that were planted purposely for whatever reason that people planted them. And the further and further you get into the woods, typically those things start to tap out. And what you do find further and further into the woods is the stuff that's spread by seed, where birds have spread it. But I always know that I'm getting close to development when I'm in the woods and I start running into certain plants. I go, maybe there was a house here originally. Maybe there was a farmstead and they planted English ivy, or they planted whatever I'm running into that isn't typical. Barberry is something you don't often see. Nandina, there's a house around somewhere. Anyway,